going to be in Galatians 5. I can remember a lot of times when I was a kid, and you probably can too, when you got in trouble, right? Yeah. Sometimes there were like little things, sometimes there were bigger things. But I remember most of the time getting in trouble thinking, it's not fair. Like, why am I getting in trouble? Why can't I do this thing that I wanted to do? I didn't realize when I would play wall ball with my friends with a hard ball above our garage doors where there was aluminum siding, that every time we hit the wall, we were knocking off chunks of aluminum. And my parents had to replace that, or at least pay for someone to come and repair it. I noticed like years later, I was like, "Dad, what is up with your siding?" And he was like, "Really?" So yeah, I didn't realize though that my decisions, the things I chose to do and the things that I chose to say affected other people, right? And we do this a lot. Joel is 5 now. When he was 2 or 3 years old, he loved to put playing cards into the vent on the HVAC return for our furnace. He didn't know that means we're going to have to replace the furnace motor because there's a bunch of like things rattling around it. And didn't know. He didn't know that his decisions, what he did and said, affected other people. And now, when he gets disciplined, if it's from Daddy, he'll run to Mommy afterward and say, "Mommy, Daddy's being mean to me." Or the other way around, if Victoria's giving the discipline, right? "Daddy, Mommy's being mean to me." And it's because he doesn't understand that the things that he is being limited on, the boundaries that we're setting, are because the things he does and says affect other people. And we're the same way when it comes to religion, right? We look at rules that maybe we don't agree with, or we're like, maybe I can bend this one because it's really not that big a deal. And we'll think like, the things that I do aren't really hurting anybody. But the truth is, we don't think about how others are affected. And so we take this really self-centered approach to the boundaries. We take this really self-centered approach to what the Bible calls sin, which is when we choose to go our way instead of God's way. We say, "Yeah, God, I know what you said. I know what you say is good, but I'm going to do my own thing anyway." It's how we rebel against God. And the Bible says that our sin is what separates us from God. It's what severs our relationship with Him. And so when we take this self-centered approach to sin, we're led to say something that maybe you've heard before or said, that religion is too strict. I don't understand this Christianity thing or this church thing. Religion is just too strict. I don't get the rules. I don't see why they apply. I don't see how the things I do affect other people. And so I want to say something to challenge us at the start. And if it challenges you a little bit, or even if it doesn't, I hope you'll stick with me today as we talk about this. Here's the challenge. I think that we need to mature in our viewpoint of boundaries. I think we need to mature in our thinking about sin and its effects. And we need to kind of grow up in how we approach these things. And recognize, as we mature in thinking about boundaries specifically, that they're actually for our good, and that within the boundaries is what actually leads to freedom and flourishing together. And so this message is kind of in 2 parts, this response to this thing that people have said, and it's made them leave church behind and not come back to church or never enter a church when we say religion is too strict. So I think there's a lot to address with this one, more than even the rest of the things that we've addressed in this series, not for me. So last night at about 6 to 10 p.m., this became a 2-part message. And the first week, today, we're going to talk about what are we set free from? How does Jesus set us free? And next week, we're going to talk a bit more about what He sets us free to. In other words, what do our lives look like as we live out this freedom that Jesus has won for us? As I said, we're going to be in Galatians 5. Galatians is a letter that a guy named Paul wrote to churches that he started in a region called Galatia, which is in modern-day Turkey. And Paul was an interesting guy. About 10 to 25 years or so after Jesus died, so their lives would have overlapped, Paul was traveling around and starting lots of churches in this area. Kind of around the north and eastern sides of the Mediterranean Sea, as we call it today. And he's a really interesting person to read about boundaries from, because before Paul became a Christian, he was a Pharisaic Jew. He was a Pharisee, and the Pharisees were known for living very strict lives. Like, this is what the law says, this is what we're supposed to do, and they were very, very strict about it, and they would impose those things on other people, and when they didn't meet them, they would just kind of look down at them. They'd thumb their nose at them. So Paul has something really interesting to say to us about imposing strict regulations and strict rules on other people, strict requirements on people. And so we're going to be in Galatians 5 this week and next, and we're going to jump around a bit. Today we'll start with 13 to 14, and then we'll read 1 through 6. And then next week we'll read about as many more verses in Galatians 5. But this is where I want to start. In Galatians 5, verses 13 to 14, it says, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free." So there's kind of our first hint that there's something wrong when we say religion is too strict. Because we're called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. So we're called to be free. What Paul is saying specifically here to these churches is that we are called to be free from the law. The law is, in the Old Testament, what God gives to his people, the Israelites. And it's part of a covenant. And Paul's saying that in this covenant, it's actually been compared to, the first 5 books of the Bible have been compared to what's known as a suzerain vassal treaty. What you need to know about that is one king would come and invade the kingdom of another king, and whoever wins this war, this battle, becomes a suzerain, kind of the ruler, and the other king is the vassal. Like, this king now serves that king. He's under his authority. And what's amazing is God actually uses that same treaty structure in his covenant with his people. It's as if to say, I am the one, he says, actually, I led you out of Egypt. I won your freedom for you. And now here's the expectations on you. Here are the boundaries for you. But what's more important actually is that he says, this is what you can expect of me. Isn't that interesting? Where a king comes and he conquers, and as part of the treaty he makes with the king he just conquered, he says, here's what you can expect of me as your ruler. Like, I have to meet expectations too. And then the treaty would have blessings if you honor it, if you abide by it. And then there would be some bad things that would happen if you don't. In other words, like, often in the situation, the king would say, I'm just going to kill all your people and take all your land, and you'll have nothing left. God doesn't quite go there. But it's the same structure. We can read through and we can see all the same sections of God's covenant, in God's covenant with his people in the Old Testament. But Paul's saying you're free from that law. That law, you're not bound to that anymore because of Jesus. Because Jesus came and fulfilled the law. And so we're not bound to it anymore. And so if we believe in Jesus, we're free from the law. And our freedom changes how we live. And freedom changes how we live. And that can go one of two ways. It can either turn us in toward ourselves, or it can turn us outward toward other people. It can make us really selfish, or it can make us love others. It can make us love ourselves and be really self-centered, or it can make us love our neighbor as ourselves. So we're set free to use our freedom for the sake of others. That's what Paul is getting at here. And you might be wondering, well, okay, if we're free from the law, though, then why do we care about this thing at the end that says the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command? If we're free from the law, why do we care about fulfilling it? What difference does that make? When Paul was writing Galatians, it was all about what we look back on today. He wouldn't have necessarily had these words in mind, but we look back on it today and often call it Christian liberty or Christian freedom, right? Now, in our culture, when we hear liberty and freedom, we're very quick to individualize those ideas. This is our problem. We make these individual ideas. Freedom and liberty is all about me and what I want and what I want to do and what I can do and when I'm going to do it and all of that. That's our problem, is we individualize these concepts. And when we do that, it actually doesn't lead to freedom and liberty. It actually kind of traps us because it leads to no rules. If we say everyone is free, everyone has their own liberty, it leads to no rules at all because I'm free to do whatever I want and you're free to do whatever you want. And if we take that another step forward, what happens is we end up with the haves and the have-nots. Because there are people who say, this is my liberty to do this and gather all this for myself. And what happens is they take it from someone else. If my liberty is unlimited, then your liberty has to be limited somehow. This happened in 2020. March 2020, COVID hit. Over the next few months, what was the important thing that you could not get in the grocery store? Toilet paper. Because what happened? People are like, the world is ending. Everything, like I'm never going to be able to leave. And the most important thing I need right now in my life is 500 rolls of toilet paper.
Yeah. 2-ply.
2-ply. Yeah. Right. And so what happened was, everybody rushed out to the store, bought up as many packs as they could, and then the one person who's just like, I just need another pack for the next month, there's nothing there. And so we run into this question, okay, what are we going to use, right? There are plenty of childhood rhymes that you could think of, right? But what are we going to use? So the first people went and they said, I have this is my freedom. I'm going to buy up all this toilet paper at the expense of somebody else's liberty who wanted to go to the store and just buy a pack of toilet paper for their family, right? So it leads to no rules. It leads to haves and have-nots. When we individualize freedom and liberty, we take from one another. In fact, in the next couple of verses, I won't read them this morning, but Paul talks about if you're not careful, you're going to bite and devour each other. If we practice freedom for ourselves, that's what happens. And so we need to mature in our thinking about freedom and liberty, just like we need to mature in our thinking about sin and boundaries. And if we are realizing that they're not individual concepts, we need to mature in thinking about them to realize that they're all about something bigger than us. They're all about community.
Yeah.
Freedom and liberty are about community. And if we're set free from the law, then all of that pointed to freedom. And all of that pointed to community. Because that's where we experience true freedom together. So the law points to community. We're loving our neighbors as ourselves. And the law points to something else too. And in chapters 3 and 4 of Galatians, Paul writes a lot about this. I won't go through every verse. I'll just kind of give a summary, otherwise we could be here forever. But Galatians 3:19 through 4:7, if you want to do your homework later and read this passage that I'm summarizing, Paul says there are two purposes for the law. So the law points to community, remember that, and there are two purposes for the law. And here's the first one he gives. The law increased transgression. It's meant to increase our transgression, and there's two ways that it does that people talk about. And I think really it's both. If you ask a biblical scholar, someone smarter than I am, they might say you have to pick one of these camps, but I think it's really kind of both. The law increases transgression in these two ways. The first is that it makes us aware of the things that we do that aren't right. There are things that, there are good ways to use our freedom and there are bad ways to use our freedom, and the law makes us aware. It's kind of this, it helps us understand what's right and what's wrong, and we wouldn't understand transgression if we didn't have something to compare it to, right? To compare our actions to. And here's the second one. The second way that the law increases transgression is that it causes sin, Paul says. I call this the wet paint theory. Like if you've ever walked past a sign on a door that says wet paint, aren't you 100 times more likely to touch the door? Like maybe carve your initials into it. Like, is it really wet? Like maybe I'll just smudge it a little bit. So Paul is saying, like, because of our human nature to rebel, like that is deep within each one of us, to rebel and be selfish. The law increases transgression because we see, I'm not supposed to do this thing. What's it like? It's not going to hurt anyone. Maybe I should just try this, right? So it increases transgression in two ways. And the other one might sound opposite, but it's not, I promise you. The law was meant to limit sin. Paul compares the law to a few different things in the end of chapter 3 and chapter 4. One of the examples that he uses is that the law is kind of like a prison guard. Like the law locked up everything that was under the control of sin, meaning it kind of it controlled sin a bit. The point he's making is like, if the law says don't murder, we'll probably stop short of that, right? Because we don't want to break the law. Or maybe we don't have that kind of innate, like, rule follower bit in us. But if the law says don't murder, like, maybe it's going to prevent someone from, like, burning down a whole village, right? Like, so it limited sin because it makes you aware of what's right and what's wrong. So in an odd sense, knowing what's right and wrong, having that from God, increases transgression, but it also limits sin. But the thing about both of these purposes of the law is that they couldn't fix our problem. Our problem is that we choose to rebel against God. Our problem is that we don't want to do the things he said. So these couldn't fix our problem. They were simply meant to point forward to something. They were meant to point forward to the one who had set us all free from the law. The law, in both of these ways, just points us forward to Jesus. That's what the law does. So keep that in mind. That's 3 and 4, the summary of what leads us right into the beginning of chapter 5 now. Here's what Paul wrote. He's going to talk about a very specific part of the law. Don't freak out. I'll explain what's going on here. He says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Mark my words. So this is, I imagine Paul like wagging his finger a little bit. Like, listen up. Pay attention to this. I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, so there's the specific part of the law we'll talk about, Christ will be of no value to you at all. So if the law points you to Jesus, and Jesus sets you free from the law, what Paul is saying is don't submit yourself back to the law. Don't carry its yoke again. Don't become a slave to something that you've already been set free from. Don't put yourself back under it. And there was this group of people that had come from Jerusalem up to this region of Galatia, so kind of around the Mediterranean Sea, backwards for you guys would be this way. And they were called Judaizers. They're called Judaizers because what they're trying to do is make people Judaize, meaning become Jewish. And there was this, a couple of different kind of marks of Jewish identity that would say, like, we're different from the rest of society. We're different from the pagans. We're different from the Romans and the Greeks. We're God's people. We're Jewish. And one of them happened to be circumcision. And so the Judaizers were coming into these churches in Galatia and saying, you have to become Jewish. You, like, the men have to be circumcised in order to follow Jesus because Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. So if you want to follow the Jewish Messiah, first you have to be Jewish. That's what they're saying. But here's, in practicality, here's what they're saying. They're saying we have this cup. And it's a pretty good cup. You can see, pretty solid. And we pour some water into it, and it does what a cup does, right? Holds the water. If I get thirsty, I can drink the water. And the good news is, I can put some more water in the cup. And as long as there's water to fill this cup, the cup will never be dry. But you know what? This is what the Judaizers say. We have this other cup. Why don't we use this one? Why don't we keep adhering to the law? Why don't we keep doing what it says? Yeah, we have this good cup over here, but let's use this broken one. That was never meant to be permanent anyway. Let's use this one that can't hold any water. That's what the Judaizers are saying. The problem with this cup, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? It doesn't hold water. It can't fulfill the purpose that it was intended to fulfill. This cup, when it runs out, it's dry. This cup leaves you empty. This cup leaves you thirsty. Paul is saying, don't use this cup anymore. We have this cup. This cup has the water of life in it. This cup has Jesus. This cup has grace. This cup's empty. Don't use that cup anymore. That's what Paul is saying. The Judaizers are saying, use that bad broken cup. I want to ask something. What does the hole in the bottom of this cup mean? It means you need a new cup. Jesus is the one who can fill us up. Jesus is the one that the law pointed to. Jesus is the one that the broken cup pointed to. And Paul says some serious words here. He says, if you let yourselves be circumcised because of obedience to the law, just simply because the law says you have to do it, if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. What he's saying is you are disregarding Christ's perfect sacrifice for all and saying, oh, no, it's not about grace. It's not a free gift. You actually have to go and do something about it. You have to change yourself. You have to earn it for yourself. So Paul says, don't disregard that. And then he goes on, says, again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised. So this is important to notice that Paul's not just talking to the Judaizers here who say you have to do this. He's actually talking to people too who could be convinced, oh, maybe I should do this. Maybe they're right. So there's both sides of this issue here. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised, that who buys into this lie, that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. This is really serious stuff Paul's talking about. He's saying if you want to be under a certain part of the law, that's fine, go ahead and do that, but then you better follow all of it. You better be able to carry out every element, every aspect, every letter of the law perfectly. That's what he says. And since no one can be perfect, we know that's a bad place to be, right? It's a bad place to be to say, yeah, I'm under the law, but I'm going to do it perfectly. We know that that's not possible because we've already talked about what our flesh wants to do. It wants to rebel. It wants to be selfish. It wants to prop up self and nobody else. Since nobody could be perfect, Paul's saying you're going to put yourself far from God. You're rejecting Jesus, saying, no thanks. Thanks for what you've done, but I can actually earn it on my own. You will end up far from God because you can't have it both ways. You can have something that's earned, but you can have something that's free, not both, right? When you go to work, you earn your wages, whatever your salary, benefits, whatever. When you go to work, you earn those things. That's why your employer gives them to you. They're not giving you a gift, but when it's your birthday, you didn't really do anything, but people give you gifts, right? Something for free, with no expectation of anything in return. You can't earn something and have it be a gift. So Paul is saying you can't have the law and grace. You can have law or grace, but not both. That's what it means to be fallen away from grace. It doesn't mean, I don't know what our typical interpretation of when people say oh yeah, they've fallen from grace. No, all that means is you're alienating yourself and you're choosing law over grace. And he continues, for through the Spirit we eagerly await by faith. Again, it's all by faith. Not what we do, not the works. We await by faith the righteousness for which we hope. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that matters. So again, we see Paul's saying if you want to do this, sure. In our modern culture, it's if you see the health benefits, sure, go ahead and do it. Neither one matters. Neither way matters. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Faith expressing itself through love. The righteousness of God is given by faith. That's how we wait for it, by faith. And it comes to us through grace, not by what we do, not by works, not by anything we can measure ourselves against, not by the law. So Paul says neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. You don't have to be part of the in-group. You don't have to join the club before following Jesus or saying yes to Jesus, before believing in Jesus. You don't have to change anything about yourself. You don't have to fix yourself or change the way you talk or anything like that. You don't have to be part of the club because Jesus came as a perfect sacrifice for all people. So he set us free from the law, and only faith matters. And this is important, that faith expresses itself through love. So we are saved by grace, through faith, through believing in Jesus. And the natural response to that is an expression of love. It's not that the things we do to love our neighbor is checking a box that says, okay, now we receive grace. It's not that the things we do checks a box to say, okay, now I'm good for eternal life. It's all through grace. And because of our gratefulness, we respond in love. That's what's happened here. So faith is expressed through love. So grace sets us free from the law to love. That's what Paul is saying here. Sets us free from the law to love. And the distinguishing factor is faith. That's the difference. Because if we believe in Jesus, and here's what I mean when I say if we believe in Jesus. We believe that Jesus is God in the flesh, that he lived a perfect life, that he died for our sins, and then he rose again to conquer death. If we believe those things, then we have to realize that we're free, we're set free, but our freedom is not for ourselves. We have to realize we're part of something bigger than ourselves. We're called to be a part of a loving community, where we love one another and prop up one another and consider others more important than ourselves. And if we don't believe in Jesus, we don't believe those things that I said about Jesus, then it's true that we have freedom to the extent that nobody gets to tell us what to do. Right? Your rules don't apply to me because they're based on something I don't care about. But where does that leave us? Under the law. If the law pointed to Jesus and Jesus sets us free and we reject that, we're stuck under the law. And we've already agreed this morning that that's a bad place to be because nobody's going to measure up to the law. Nobody's going to fulfill it perfectly. So if we believe in Jesus and we're free from the law, and it's not to do whatever we want, but we're free to love. So when we're freed from something, in God's kingdom, he always frees us to something. He doesn't just say that doesn't apply. He says, I have something better for you. We're going to get more into that next week. But grace sets us free from the law to love. And Jesus got this. Like he knew this. He understood this. Jesus knew that he was the fulfillment of the law. He was the thing it pointed to. So I think it's safe to say that he knew he was free. He knew he had freedom. And yet he knew that his freedom was to be used to set others free, to set the world free, anyone who would believe in him. So he didn't use his freedom for himself, he used his freedom for us. In John 15:13, this is Jesus talking. He says, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. That's what Jesus said, and that's what Jesus did, because he knew his freedom wasn't about him. His freedom was about a community. His freedom was about love and relationship. And so if we're set free for the sake of freedom, and it's Jesus who set us free, then our freedom is also not for us. It's not for ourselves. It's for the purpose of community and relationship and care for one another. It's for freedom, like I said in verse 1, it's for freedom that Jesus has set us free. And it's not to be chained by religious rules. We're not free to follow religious rules again. And we're free not to chain others with religious rules and hold them up to a standard that we know we can't meet ourselves. We're free to be free, right? He says for freedom you've been set free, and to invite others into that freedom, to bring that freedom to the world around us. Not to just hold it for ourselves and steal freedom from other people, but to actually invite other people out of this religiosity, out of death, and into freedom and into real love. So we're going to have some time to reflect. Toto's going to play a little guitar to, again, just help focus our minds. And let's reflect on a couple of things during this time, just for the next couple minutes. And ask God how we need him to reshape our view of freedom. How does he need us to mature in the way that we view freedom, in the way that we use freedom? And then where do we need God to move in our hearts, or to move our hearts from law to love? Away from law, away from legalism, away from religion, and into